Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Mansfield Dialogue series with United States Senator Bill Cassidy. My name is David Bell, and I have the honor and privilege of serving as the current board chair for the Mansfield Center. A little bit about the Mansfield Center, founded by an act of Congress in 1983 and based on the University of Montana campus in beautiful, albeit at the moment very cold, Missoula, Montana. The Mansfield Center fosters globally minded leaders of integrity in honor of the legacy of the Senate's longest serving majority leader, Senator Mike Mansfield, and his wife, Maureen Hayes Mansfield. The Mansfield Center has numerous programs, primarily focused on Asia and US relations with Asia, and I invite you to visit the Mansfield Center website to learn more and perhaps participate with your support. Most importantly, the Mansfield Center is committed to the pursuit of bipartisanship, civility, and cooperation. Senator Mansfield knew well how fragile our democracy really is. And it's an honor to have Senator Bill Cassidy here with us this evening to talk about what we can expect along those lines on the political horizon. A little bit more about Senator Cassidy. Dr. Bill Cassidy is the United States Senator from Louisiana. Bill grew up in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, and attended LSU for undergrad and medical school. In 1990, Bill joined LSU Medical School, teaching medical students and residents at Earl Long Hospital, a hospital for the uninsured. During this time, he co-founded the Greater Baton Rouge Community Clinic, the clinic providing free dental and health care to the working uninsured. Bill also created a private-public partnership to vaccinate 36,000 Greater Baton Rouge area children against hepatitis B at no cost to the schools or the parents. In the wake of Hurricane Katrina, Bill led a group of healthcare volunteers to convert an abandoned Kmart building into an emergency healthcare facility, providing basic healthcare to hurricane evacuees. In 2006, Bill was elected to the Louisiana State Senate. Then in 2008, he was elected to the United States House of Representatives. Then in 2014, he was elected to the United States Senate. He has on several important committees at the US Senate. He serves on the Finance Committee, the curiously named HELP Committee, which is the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee, the Energy and Natural Resources Committee, and the Veteran Affairs Committee. Following numerous successful legislative accomplishments, Bill was re-elected in 2020 to a second term in the US Senate. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, Bill is married to Dr. Laura Cassidy, a retired general surgeon specializing in breast cancer, who sounds even cooler than Bill, and they have 3 children. Bill's also affiliated and has worked with No Labels, and No Labels is our partner in this discussion this evening. And if you have not heard or know about No Labels, I encourage you to visit the No Labels website. They are the organizers of the Problem Solver Caucus, which is the House side, and the complementary side on the Senate, of which Senator Cassidy is a part. And No Labels has really been a driving force in helping facilitate collaboration among our elected officials, working together across party lines to think of America first. So with that, Senator Cassidy, it is a pleasure to have you. Thank you for joining us this evening. I know it's a few hours later for you. Thank you for being here.
Hey, thank you, David, very much. I'll make a couple of comments, and I think we're going to open up for questions. I'm going to paraphrase something the former Prime Minister of Israel said recently, that it's no longer right versus left, but it's those who wish to get something done versus those who wish merely to yell at each other. Now, I think that we're about to, I hope, emerge from a phase where people were less concerned about getting something done and kind of more concerned for other things. It doesn't mean you're not a liberal or a conservative or progressive, whatever your label is. It just means that you make a commitment within your values to get something done, which is positive. I'm trying to adjust my thing. So I would argue, in fact, if you look at my voting record, I'm one of the more conservative senators there is. But I've been very able to work with people from across the political spectrum on things that are of mutual interest. We don't work together on everything, but there's enough folks who can find those areas of common interest. We can actually accomplish something. One example, my wife my youngest daughter is dyslexic. 20% of us watching right now are dyslexic. You just learn to read differently. But if you're not taught differently, you may never learn to read. So because my wife, when she retired from surgery to raise her children are raised, my youngest is dyslexic, she focuses all of that general surgeon intensity on finding solutions for dyslexia. That is something which can cross ideological or party boundaries. Because if your child or if you are dyslexic, you are going to seek a solution no matter your label. So no labels, if you will. And so we are able to come together to find solutions for those 20% of our children who need to learn to read differently if they are going to learn to read, to achieve their fullest potential. One example, which doesn't neatly fall into a compartment. I could go through other things as well, but I'll just open it up to David, but I just want to say that our country right now needs to get things done. And the leadership of our country is going to reflect the voters who send us here. And so this is a partnership. So although we just went through an election, if you think that we should be a society which focuses on getting things done, you can be a conservative or a progressive, but still we need to get things done. If you're engaged, then the people who represent you will reflect your values. So I'll say that at the end, and I'll say it halfway in between, because that's truly how I think our democracy should work. It is how it does work. And I'm here to kind of give testament to that philosophy.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah. And so let's maybe start by setting the stage of where we're at in this kind of political chess game. And then from there, maybe we can think about where and under what subjects you think there might be opportunities to accomplish legislative achievements, whether those are in some cases purely partisan ones, or in some cases, hopefully some bipartisan accomplishments. But as we sit here today, Senator, correct me if I'm wrong, but the Republicans will retake the House, albeit by a thinner margin than was predicted by most of the major polling outfits. The Democrats will retain control of the Senate. The Georgia runoff is important because a 49-51 split is different than a 50-50 split. And so that kind of defines the landscape in front of us, but there's a lot of reading to do before we get to that next chapter, because we're entering that lame duck session. And so can we just spend a couple of minutes talking about what your views of the lame duck session might include, whether that's opportunities for bipartisanship, whether that's threats to bipartisanship because of the unique chemistry that occurs within a lame duck session? What's your view of the lame duck landscape?
Well, I thought LSU was going to be Texas A&M. So let's just say that I'm not really good at looking at crystal balls. But that said, I think the Democratic House, of course, would like to take this opportunity to pass, though they won't be in the majority for 2 years. So they would like to take this opportunity to pass whatever they can. Typically at the end of the year, it is a large spending bill, which you could lump things into. I can tell you the way it's going to play, in which Congress is supposed to leave for Christmas vacation on Thursday, on Friday, whatever, pick the date, December the 17th. And that may be a weekend, but you get the point. And there'll be a large spending bill, which is released 1.5 days prior to when everybody wants to go home. And it's going to be a Friday, and you want to get home, and they're not going to give you any time to read it, but they're going to put all sorts of priorities in there of different people. It's a lousy way to do government, but that would be a way to pass a lot of legislation that otherwise would either not pass on its own, or because it's lumped into this bill, folks will vote for the large piece of legislation because they want that particular bit of legislation to pass. So I can imagine an omnibus, as it's called, such as that, could pass with a lot of bipartisan work, and Mike Mansfield will be rolling over in his grave because it's really not the way our founding fathers drew it up. Alternatively, there could be something called a continuing resolution, which only funds the government through next January or February. There's some political dynamics there. Kevin McCarthy will most likely be the Speaker of the House, but his majority will be razor thin. 4 people have announced that they will vote against him already. They only have 222. So that cuts him to 218, which is the absolute minimal he needs to pass. Does he really want to have in January a major fight over spending bills? Probably not. He's just trying to keep people together, and anything controversial, he'll have a very difficult time passing with only a 4-vote margin. So you have a dynamic coming up where normally Republicans wouldn't mind the spending bill being kicked into January, but maybe this time they don't want it to kick in because of just the politics of the nature. So there will be bipartisanship, I think. And I think the bipartisanship will be a combination of Democrats on the House trying to get one last bite at the apple, and maybe Republicans not really sure they want this battle right off the bat in a new Congress in January.
Interesting. So bipartisanship in an ugly way, maybe is
Yeah, and a lot of times bipartisanship happens in an ugly way. You know, the old quote by Bismarck: if you like sausage, you don't want to see it being made. So similarly, if you like laws being passed, you may not want to see the process by which they get to the point of being passed.
Right. Well, thank you. And just for our viewing audience, feel free. I know a number of people already have. Feel free to submit questions into the chat, and I'll do my best to cover those as we move along. Just one more lame duck related question. I've observed, you tell me if this is wrong or what you think about it, that there were members on both sides of the aisle, both Democrats and Republicans, who were primaried by their own party and lost in the primary. And it strikes me that we have some pretty moderate, thoughtful people leaving Congress and being replaced by folks who are a little further out on the respective extremes. And it seems like this dynamic occurs on both sides of the aisle. Does that change or factor into the lame duck calculus when you have these folks who are stepping away, particularly if they're stepping away because they were primaried by their own party?
There is, I think, a statistical analysis that showed that people who are not returning for whatever reason are willing to take votes that otherwise they may not take. Tougher votes, if you will. But David, you just raised the possibility maybe the reason they're not coming back is because they took tough votes and they've been primaried and they've lost. That's possible. So yes, you can already see that there's people who are not returning who have stepped forward to take some tougher votes that maybe you wouldn't have thought them to take otherwise. And I suspect that will continue through the lame duck. So whatever it is, whether it's because they lost because they take them or they're not coming back so they will take them, that dynamic I think will occur.
And then, so as we kind of move beyond the lame duck session and we think about the new Congress being seated, what are areas of your focus? What are some of your priorities? I mean, you already have, I think, a track record, and with it, some street cred with your fellow senators on both sides of the aisle. So you're a natural person to look to say, can you offer us some predictions of your own based on some of your own policy priorities that you intend to pursue, and perhaps, if it makes sense, to recruit others from the opposite side of the aisle?
Well, you're not going to pass anything first. Inherently, if you need 60 votes to pass something in the Senate, and both parties are roughly around 50, whatever you pass has to be bipartisan, period, end of story. And now with the House being Republican and the Senate being Democrat, it's just got to be bipartisan, period, end of story. So whenever we're working on a major piece of legislation, I always ask my team, who is our Democratic colleague? Who are the people in the House that we're going to work on, both the Republican and the Democratic side? Can we come together? What are their interests? So things that I'm working on for the lame duck include something, the RISE Act. Suffice it to say, with rising sea levels, everybody living on a coastline or within 100 miles of a coastline is at increased risk of flooding. we can address that proactively, attempting to mitigate that risk now, but it takes money. So I'm working with Democrats and Republicans to create a fund using royalty payments from offshore wind and offshore oil and gas, a fund that would help coastal states to mitigate the risk of flooding. It's kind of, if you pay me now a little bit, or you pay me later a lot. Louisiana is kind of ground center for this. All the water flowing out of Missoula eventually goes past my hometown of Baton Rouge. And when it hits the Gulf of Mexico, that relative sea level rise means that Louisiana has lost as much land mass as the entire state of Delaware. But to pass this legislation, we have to have Democrats and Republicans. And frankly, we have to have kind of very pro-environmental Democrats. And I'm a very pro-oil and gas Republican. So it's a real classic example of us working through our differences, finding common ground, knowing the limits of what either side can achieve, and getting something that I think would do something really positive for our country. That's called the RISE Act, and I'm hoping we can pass it in the lame duck. Another thing I'm working on, Social Security is going insolvent in 5 or 6 years. Now, Social Security will only pass with a bipartisan solution, if only because the other side will demagogue if one side tries to do it alone. And scaring people who are going to go into Social Security that they're going to lose their Social Security is a political trick that was used most recently in this last election. But it is a program going insolvent in 13 years, 12 years now, probably 12 years now. Insolvent, meaning that when it runs out of money in the trust fund, the only money that can be paid for benefits is that which is currently going in, which is currently being received. And the average Social Security beneficiary under law will have about a 25% cut in the payments that she or he is receiving. Now, people aren't talking about that. Like, why aren't we talking about it? But I'm hoping to work with a bipartisan group of senators and members of Congress, bipartisan with the White House, to find a solution that strengthens and preserves the program. It's a big deal, but if we're not taking on big things, what are we trying to do? Some other stuff we're working on. I'm going to be the HELP Committee, Health, Education, Labor, and Pension. David mentioned my chairman will be Bernie Sanders. Bernie is liberal, I'm conservative. We're already talking about things we can work together. There is a huge shortage of nursing people power, if you will. And so we need to find a solution. I think that solution can be held regardless of party affiliation. And so Bernie and I are already committing, what can we do to help ease the shortage of nursing? I could go on for big and small. I've already mentioned dyslexia, big and small, but there's a lot of things you can work on that don't require a party label to find a solution to.
Those are great examples, and talk about some meaty policy ambitions to tackle those. I mean, climate, Social Security, I mean, that's not small ball in terms of ambition, but that's great. It strikes me, listening to you describe what you're going to tackle and how you're going to go about it. It sounds like a very different world in terms of bipartisanship than almost everything else that we as non-elected officials hear and see and feel about DC, which is bitter partisanship where you're not just my opposition, you're my enemy. And the way you've just described members of the opposite party, including somebody like Bernie Sanders, who, you know, as you stated, I mean, you're a kind of pro oil and gas conservative Southern senator, and Bernie Sanders is not, right? He's the other side. But you just described a landscape in which you two have already engaged in a dialogue in an attempt to get something done. So here's my question: is there actually more of that going on in DC than we are generally aware of?
Yes.
More bipartisanship, more attempts at least at working together? Because you certainly wouldn't know that by reading anything at all in the press.
Yeah, so obviously you're more likely to get on cable news, or you're more likely to be quoted in an article if it's some measure of conflict. That just lends itself to more clicks. But let me just give you some things that have, you know, passed that everybody's going to be aware of that happened on a bipartisan basis. We had, I think, 3 different COVID relief packages. when the economy almost completely shut down, and there had to be quick action in order to keep small businesses. Every place you go, the payroll protection plan benefit. So David, you're in Missoula, there are payroll protection plans there. New Orleans, Shreveport, Louisiana, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, that program went nationwide. It was totally bipartisan. The bipartisan infrastructure bill, which is going to bring benefits to Americans in any community in which you live. The surprise medical billing bill, the No Surprises Act, something I worked on with Maggie Hassan. It was my Democratic lead, but we had 3 and 3 in terms of Democrats, Republicans. We had bipartisan on the House. The bipartisan infrastructure bill, the No Surprises Act is preventing roughly, I'm told 9 million surprise medical bills have been prevented this year. Now, there's somebody sitting here right now saying, hey, I went to the hospital, my insurance was supposed to cover it, and it didn't, and I'm in network, but I'm getting an out-of-network bill. If that's true, there's a 1-800 number you can call for the federal government to investigate. But most likely, it's already been stopped because the hospitals and the insurance companies know they have to pay. That's a huge bill that's passed that I was involved with, so I can speak to directly. I could keep going, but VA bills are routinely passing. The PAC Act, which John Tester, the senator from Montana, is the head of the VA committee, which is going to help those folks in Iraq who got exposed to burn pits get the treatment that they may need for a medical condition which results from burn pit. So I could keep going, but those are significant major pieces of legislation which have passed, which on a bipartisan basis.
That's great. And it's also hopeful. I think that's what people, it doesn't paper over the partisanship reality that exists probably at a heightened level in DC, but it's very inspiring to hear firsthand that there's actually a lot more camaraderie, a lot more attempts at working together than anybody in the media, whether it's television or print, would have us believe.
Well, if the people demand that their elected representatives actually get something done, something's more likely to happen. After the shooting in Uvalde, Texas, a tragic shooting, we passed major legislation which protected Second Amendment rights, by the way. I'm a big Second Amendment guy, but nonetheless put in provisions that made it harder for those who should not have weapons to get the weapons, and made it easier for someone who might be 17 years old with a criminal history or a history of psychosis, dangerous psychosis, instead of having the records totally sealed on age 18, and one day after his 18th birthday goes out and buys a weapon, gives the courts the ability to open up a court record, look back into that adolescence and see if there's a reason why he should not buy. In the meantime, same package, we put out billions to provide mental health services to school children, but also those living in rural areas. So the kind of emotional outcry after that horrific shooting in Uvalde compelled Congress to act, overcoming barriers that people otherwise may not have overcome. You can't underestimate the power of the American people petitioning their representatives. I guess I just want to stress that once more.
That's great. That's great. Let me pivot to a few questions because they're rolling in, and I can already feel myself running out of time here without being able to address them. So I apologize to all of you on if I'm not able to get to your questions. But Martin Finnegan asks, he observes that there are 58 members of the Problem Solver Caucus. That's obviously on the House side. And for those of you not familiar with the Problem Solver Caucus, there's an equal number of Republicans and Democrats. That's one of the conditions of being a member of the caucus. And there is kind of a comparable group of senators over on the Senate side. And the question that Martin asks is, how many senators have been involved in various bipartisan initiatives, like as a complement to the PSC, and is that number likely to shrink next year?
Well, we have some people leaving who may not have been part of No Labels, if you will, but they certainly were within the spirit of No Labels. Alan Simpson the senator, let me first start over. There's probably about, well, in the Uvalde bill, 7 Republicans joined all the Democrats. And on the way back, the COVID spending relief bill, we probably had, probably 10 or 20 Democrats join Republicans. So let's just say that there's a group of about 25 on any given issue on any given side may participate in something with greater frequency as you get to a smaller number. But Alan Simpson once said, you know, when you first get elected to the Senate, you spend your first 6 years full of vim and vigor, making fiery speeches and et cetera, et cetera. And then your second 6 years, you decide you actually want to get something done. And you sit down and you begin to work with the other side. So yes, we're losing people who've got a track record of working on bipartisan legislation. And they'll be replaced by people who say, you know, I've been here long enough to want to start getting things done. So the institution renews itself. And sure, there's people leaving, but there's a great quote by Charles de Gaulle. He said that the graveyard is filled with essential people. There's no one person who's so essential to the functioning of the U.S. Senate that we cannot still conduct business without she or he.
That's good. From de Gaulle, no less. Well, here's another question, kind of pivoting around here to grab these audience questions. Lots of appreciation for you and your time, Senator. So I'll skip those, even though all of these seem to be started by it. This anonymous person observes that our national political problems might be corrected by true campaign finance reform and term limits. And what are your thoughts on these 2 issues? Anything else that you could see that might reduce the partisanship in DC?
Yeah, well, I'll go back. You can make a case for money in politics, and you can make a case for term limits. Totally accept that. And you can make a case against them, by the way. You know, if you limit the money in politics, you actually have a built-in advantage for the incumbent, because the incumbent starts off with name recognition, whereas the challenger has to achieve it in most circumstances. And money is a great equalizer. But that said, you can make a case either way. The real issue for bipartisanship is for the people to demand it. If the people demand solutions, and if they're willing to engage and understand that, you know, I don't get everything, I just get most of what I want, we have bipartisan solutions. If it's only the extremes who are demanding never to work together, then we end up with an incredibly polarized Congress in which no one works together. So it is a participatory democracy. I'll say that on surprise medical billing, you can kind of go through the timeline. I had a sense of it. I'm a doc. And so I had a sense that this is going to be a big issue. So I had my team start to work on it. About that time, the New York Times and the Washington Post began to publish articles. I'm sure people did elsewhere as well, about egregious instances of surprise medical bills. There was a woman in Boston who began to, just a kind of well-off woman, began to run videos, taking stories of people being totally ripped off by hospitals. And there just kind of organically came this movement to address the issue. And doctors begin to come up, and they would connect with me, and they would say, we know we can't get everything, but we want to take the patient out of the middle. So can we work on a solution which the patient's taken out of the middle? And the hospitals and the insurance companies understood they had to have the same goal. So we took the patient out of the middle. That was driven by outcry from the American people. It sounds kind of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. It really works. If the people demand it, it's going to have a bipartisan solution.
That's great. And so that's a kind of a good segue to Kenneth Hapner's question, because he asks, what procedures or regulations are available to limit extreme/disruptive views, right or left, that are voiced in Congress by members of Congress? We've all seen examples on both sides of highly inappropriate comments that also just suck the air out of the room, and everything points towards this kind of very small fringe. Is there anything that can be done to try to address that? And that's what Kenneth asks.
You notice those sorts of people rarely, if ever, move into leadership of either party. You can't restrict a member of Congress or a senator from doing whatever she or he says. Our founding fathers gave great leeway to elected representatives to say things on the floor of the House or the Senate. And you can go on cable TV and you can see all that. Gets lots of clicks, you can raise money, all that. You're never going to be in leadership, because leadership is never going to take the risk of you embarrassing the entire party, whichever party you're a member of, by saying something so intemperate that it reflects upon everybody. So you can't really limit it, but outside of the social media and cable news sphere, their influence becomes pretty isolated. So that may not be entirely satisfactory, because they really can poison the public dialogue, but at least it's somewhat limiting.
Sure. So you can't prevent them from making provocative comments, but you can at least prevent them from having power within the party. Is that a fair point?
And when I say you, I mean, I would say that's going to be your party leadership. Now, by the way, yeah, it's going to be their party leadership. They're never going to be placed in a position in which, let me start over. The balance of power in our country is held by independents. And we saw this in this past election, which the way the independents go is the side that's going to win. And so if independents are so disturbed by antics on one side or the other, they move to the opposite side. Leadership of the parties are well aware of this. So yes, you have to speak to your base. I got to speak to conservatives, but by golly, I better also be speaking to moderates and maybe even people who are a little bit left of center, but are looking for an alternative. And you win by addition. For a while, it looked as if, no, they were all going to be base elections. Just turn out your base, you're going to win. This past election, we saw independents, if they were presented with candidates that they did not like, broke to the other side, and folks who weren't expected to win did win. Again, the American people have a power that sometimes they don't fully appreciate.
That's great. That's great. So again, kind of continuing, I'm going to jump around topics here. David and Kimball ask a question. I've heard this question addressed in the negative by almost every other person who's answered it. Maybe you'll give us some ray of hope, but is there any chance of immigration reform in the upcoming congressional session?
So I just was at a meeting with a gentleman I'm working very closely with, and in the Democratic caucus. And he had to leave our meeting because he was going to meet with some other people, including Republicans, to work on immigration reform. So I can't promise you anything because it's a tough issue. It's a tough issue, but I can tell you people are working on it, and that's the ray of hope. I'm not part of that group. I can't tell you the likelihood for success, but it's something that we have to address. Absolutely,
on so many levels. Well. Okay, well, here, let me move to the next one. Bruce Graving asks, and this is interesting. We saw this have some kind of curious outcomes in Alaska, and we saw it in New York City, but ranked choice voting has been adopted in a couple different places. And Bruce asks you, Senator, what your view of ranked choice voting might be, and will it contribute to more collaboration?
You know, Louisiana has, let me start over. If you look at, we always had Democrats, Republicans, but now those two sides are shrinking and the number of independents is increasing. Folks are saying, pox on both your houses, we want to be independent. Now, they may still lean left or right, but nonetheless, they wish to be independent. That's a growing group. So if you have a closed party primary, you're really locking out all those independents as to, you know, what is their voice on who's going to ultimately represent. Now, Louisiana has an open primary system, a so-called jungle primary. Everybody runs against everybody. And that allows those independents to vote for the person whom they wish to vote for. So, and it tends to kind of keep the extreme from dominating. So if independents are those who just don't want to put up with some really crazy person, whoever that crazy person is, left or right, and so they become an independent, well, you kind of further distill down your party as to be just those who kind of like that activity. If you open it up, then you're going to have to get somebody who appeals to a broader segment of society. Louisiana has a Democratic governor. We've got 2 Republican senators. Our open primary allowed that Democratic governor to win. his seat. Now, whatever I think about it, just kind of the people spoke. I believe in democracy. I think it works. So ranked choice obviously just worked in Maine, New York, and Alaska. It takes a long time to figure out. That seems to be a problem with it. I think you can substantially get to where you want to be with ranked choice just by having an open primary and whittling it down to 2 people. But whatever works for a society, I just think that open primaries or ranked choice primaries are a little bit better than closed primaries, which totally excludes 1/3 to 40% of the electorate.
Interesting. Well, I feel like I should ask this question, even though I really don't want to.
Uh-oh.
I feel like if I don't ask a question about President Trump, that I'll be the elephant in the room, even though I'm exhausted by the topic already. But I'm not even sure what the question is I want to ask. I did see it come across the wire. You were one of the first to comment on this recent dinner that he hosted, which has certainly resulted in responses from members of both parties. I saw that you had a response there. What else can I say? What do you? Is there anything any thoughts that you can offer this group about the landscape of President Trump deciding that he's going to run for president again and seek the nomination within the Republican Party?
Well, you got a lot in there, David.
I know. I'm sorry.
Let's go back to LSU and Texas A&M. No, first, I don't think President Trump's anti-Semitic. His wife is, his daughter is Jewish. His son-in-law, whom he obviously has great regard for, is Jewish. But when you're in a position of leadership, everything you do gives encouragement to others one direction or another. And if it appears that there is acceptance of such viewpoints, white nationalism or anti-Semitism, that encourages those who want to be encouraged along that pathway. The leader has the responsibility to encourage us in a better way. Now, when I mentioned that Congress is representative of the people, I think everybody would agree that our society writ large is having a lot of division. And united we stand, divided we fall. So I personally think that the role of the leader should be to encourage us to be united. Yes, we have differences. I'm not Pollyannish about it, but we're first children of God. We're second Americans. And so and then we are whatever label you want to put on somebody. So if we can take that viewpoint, I think it's better. Clearly, the message from President Trump's dinner was quite different than that, and quite different to 2, if you will, offending groups that unfortunately have lots of reasons to be concerned. As regards President Trump running for president, clearly he has the right to. But I've said previously publicly that I just don't think we're going to win the next presidency if he is our nominee. Mm-hmm. And I think he has spoken for a lot of Americans, feeling as if the system was rigged against them, feeling like actions had to be taken against China that had not been taken by previous administrations. That maybe we had to pay a little bit more attention to working Americans who have been left behind by some of our trade policies. Those are all good things and I fully support. But there's a lot of other things that I terribly oppose. And I think that the large number of voters oppose. And I just think it'd be a difficult choice for the Republican Party for president. Yeah,
well, thank you for tackling that question. I certainly agree with you on that. And it's a tricky one for the party in the country.
Well, you got to separate out the fact, really interesting, last Saturday night or the Saturday night before, Dave Chappelle did a Saturday Night Live skit. He's funny, you ought to do it. But he spoke a little bit about Trump speaking to people in a way that they had not previously been spoken to. And there's validity to that. And so if we don't understand the frustration of the American people in terms of having their concerns addressed in a significant, meaningful way, then we're not going to serve the American people as they should be served. But that doesn't mean that we should turn a blind eye to other things that happen, such as January 6th or other things, which I think just in my mind are disqualifying.
Thank you. Thank you for tackling that. Well, there are a number of questions asked in various different ways, some constructive, some less so, about the Marriage Equality Act from today, Roe v. Wade, and some of these other kind of lightning rod issues. And so I guess I'm going to try to package up more than a half dozen versions of these and ask, are some of these those topics that you and members are going to vote on based on conscience, and they're not necessarily going to be the same policy type discussions that are ripe for bipartisanship? Or, I mean, how do you look at those types of issues of conscience, as I think one person described them, which I think is a good description, versus some of these other policy level agenda items that you're clearly targeting broad bipartisanship efforts on?
I'm going to take your question a little bit differently than you ask. I'll get back to it, but I'll get there. I think the Dobbs decision is an interesting decision. For those who are pro-choice, and what I'm about to say, I'm not endorsing it. I'm just doing it. I'm a doctor. I'm analyzing it like a doctor would analyze it. It took a decision that was made on a federal level and returned it to states. If your state has liberal abortion laws, they will continue to have liberal abortion laws. If your state prefers to have a different set of abortion laws, then your state will have a different set of abortion laws. But the reality of the fact that the abortifacient pills can be sent through the mail means, and most abortions occur within the first trimester, and that's when these pills are to be used, means that whatever I think about it, that these will still be available through the mail. And so I was a little bit, I don't say amused, but when people in California were so concerned about Dobbs, but California abortion laws will remain as liberal as they always were. I had a doctor from New Jersey saying that she was fearful for her patients. Well, New Jersey laws aren't going to change. I would think a doctor would know that, saying that as a doctor. So it's being used as a political tool. But it's interesting, the fact that it's being removed from the federal level down to the state level may remove it as such a potent issue from the federal legislation. Right now, if the party leaders want to get all the Democrats to vote one way and all the Republicans to vote one way, they throw abortion into the mix. And about 95% of each party will go to their corner because now abortion's in the mix. So it's actually used as a tool to manipulate, if you will, to exacerbate partisanship. And if you don't want to have partisanship, they'll keep abortion out so that they can get a bipartisan group together to vote for something. I mean, you just see it played out over and over again. So it may be, since we started off talking about partisanship and bipartisanship, that the removal of this Dobbs removal down to the state level will actually enable more bipartisanship on a federal level. On the Respect for Marriage Act, which passed tonight, we've got culture wars. So the issue is, how do you end culture wars? Those who are concerned about same-sex marriage wanted a federal recognition that if somebody moved from one state, their marriage will be honored. Even though every Supreme Court justice but one suggested that this decision, that Obergefell, would not be revisited. I can respect that, though, the need for reassurance. But then you speak to people who believe in traditional marriage, and they wanted to have their own concerns addressed. Could you have this kind of, symmetry? Okay, you're concerned about your marriage being recognized. If I'm a small business person who believes in traditional marriage and doesn't want to make a website for a same-sex marriage, can I have some protection from lawsuits? Well, the group pushing the Respect for Freedom of Marriage Act, did not want to give in on that. They did not want to give the kind of, okay, you're a small business person, less than 50 employees, less than 10 employees, less than 5 employees, we're not going to sue you. they didn't want to give that sort of mutual sort of we won't attack you if you won't attack us. Now, I think we can move beyond culture wars, but there has to be a symmetrical decision to find peace on both sides of the culture wars. And when there is that, Mike Lee, for example, had an amendment tonight, and I'm told that Mike said that if his amendment passed, that he would vote for the bill. His amendment did not pass. And in his mind, his amendment would have just been a symmetrical kind of, okay, we're not going to fight each other sort of thing. It's probably not a very satisfactory answer to those who care deeply about same-sex marriage. But if we're going to make a decision to move beyond culture wars, then everybody's going to have to give a little bit. And ideally, they give simultaneously. And so everybody gets a little bit out of it. And if not, I think we'll continue to fight culture wars.
Interesting. Thank you for tackling that so thoughtfully. That's I appreciate that. And interesting, your comment about removing it from the federal level down to the state level. Every Supreme Court nominee that has occurred since I've been living, it seems like where the prospective justice stands on Roe v. Wade has been the central point of kind of partisan alignment. Do you feel that Dobbs effectively removes that question and therefore will fundamentally change the landscape of the next Supreme Court nominee, whoever and whenever that person in that time is?
Again, I thought LSU was going to be Texas A&M. So, and I thought Ohio State was going to be Michigan. So I'm probably the wrong guy to be asking. I think there's a certain inertia, though, in people's attitudes. They're always fighting the last battle. So it may take a while for it to play out, for people to realize that really, if this is your issue, your state legislature is where you need to be. There will still be influence on a federal level. Make no mistake about that. But I think that the influence will become, again, less and less. So I think over time, the discussion will be less about that. And by the way, if you've noticed, all those Supreme Court nominees are coached in such a way as that they can get around that question. And whatever their attitude is, they still get nominated. That's not where they go up or down. But on the main, I do think that because of Dobbs, there'll be less influence, maybe not in Supreme Court decisions right away, but in general, there'll be less influence overall.
Excellent. Well, maybe we've got time for maybe one or two more questions, but before I ask you that, why don't you tell us, you mentioned right before we went on camera that you were actually going to be the +1 at an award that your wife was receiving. Can you tell us what that is?
Yeah, my wife, again, she started a public charter school for children with dyslexia in Baton Rouge. And now they've started another school that's been going for about 10 years. She's collaborating with a group out of Yale, Dr. and Dr. Shaywitz, who literally wrote the book on dyslexia. And so Laura works with them, and it's the first public charter school using a science-based curriculum in the nation. Well, now she started a second school. She's starting a third school next year and a fourth school also next year, a high school next year. And she has mentored those in other states attempting to start similar schools. And so there is a school choice organization, the YAS Prize. That's one group that she's already received an award from. She wasn't first, she was like a runner-up, but they still, the YASs are incredibly generous. And so we're going up for a dinner for them. And there's another dinner we're going for. I'm the +1, but again, related to her work with dyslexia. If you will, she's trying to take what the Shaywitz have done at Yale and translate it into how it can actually help children, not in a very expensive private school, but in a public school in which anyone can participate. Her point was that, we could afford to send our daughter to a private school, but what if you're a single mom, 3 kids? It never would happen. And so she wants this school to be for everybody, not just those of a certain means. By the way, Some of you are dyslexic, some of you have children who are dyslexic. The name of our school is Louisiana Key Academy. They have a website, and so you can log on if you're interested. Dyslexia is one of those things that we need parents to lead the way on.
Excellent. Well, that's inspiring. That's inspiring. Well, let me just wrap it up. We're heading towards the top of the hour here, and let me just kind of ask you to give your final thoughts on the broad topic of hope and what you see in the future. We live in the greatest country in the history of the world. We are in a particularly challenging time. Those challenges are all around us. I don't think people need to be reminded of what they need to be worried about in the fragility of our democracy. But as you look out on the horizon, aside from the risks, and feel free to mention them if you think that we should make sure that we're sensitized to them, but what do you see that gives you hope and optimism about 2023 and our nation and the possibility that we can, as a country, begin to mend some of the wounds and kind of tamp down the culture wars and not see ourselves as the enemy, because we have a lot of folks beyond our borders that would be and are currently exploiting that. And so what do you see as that makes you hopeful about the year ahead?
You know, the greatness of our country is from the American people. That sounds trite, but it is so true. And it's a ballast in our society. I had people come to me and say, you know, I'm sick of this and I'm sick of that. I just want to see things done. And I think there's been kind of this kind of high emotion that we've had, that people are starting to kind of shake it off a little bit and to say, hey, maybe I need to tone it down a little bit. Again, it doesn't mean you're not a liberal. It doesn't mean you're not a conservative. It just means you want to be constructive and that you recognize there's things upon which you can work, that even if you're conservative or a liberal, you can still find common ground with those who might feel a little differently and get something accomplished. And occasionally you accept something you're not wowed about. But hey, I've been married for 33 years. I've learned to accept an occasional thing I'm not wowed about. And probably, I think my wife has too. I'm not sure about that. But the point, anybody in a human relationship understands that occasionally you make a little bit of, okay, you can have your way, as long as you're pointing to the common direction. We got big issues. We've mentioned Social Security going insolvent. We've mentioned our debt and deficit. We've mentioned immigration. We've mentioned these social issues that we've got to find bridges over. We can speak about racial divides, et cetera. We can find solutions, but we have to be those who are not angrily yelling at each other, but those who are seeking to find common ground with those. Sometimes we can't, most times we can, to find those solutions and bring those solutions to bear to make our country a better place. We can do it. The greatness of our American people is what gives me hope.
That's excellent. And what a fitting way to conclude this Mansfield dialogue. Senator Cassidy, I hope and pray that the spirit that you've just conveyed is infectious amongst not just Republicans, but your contemporaries on the Democratic side too. It's really been a pleasure to spend time with you this evening. Really appreciate your time and thoughtfulness and demonstrating to folks that you can clearly be a unapologetic conservative or an unapologetic liberal and still come together, find common ground where it's possible, acknowledge that it's not always possible, but that we need to remain civil with one another and think of America first. It's really been an honor to speak with you. Thank you for what you do for our country and for your great state of Louisiana. And with that, we'll bid you farewell and good night. And thank you everyone for joining us this evening. And we'll look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you, David. Thank you all.